Good morning. I'm Aaron Hall, an attorney for business owners and entrepreneurial companies. We are coming to you live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So we are doing a live Q&A today, like we do on a regular basis. That means that the questions today ideally are submitted by you. Love to have your comments added in the comment section below. Whatever platform you're on, feel free to add them. And my assistant will look through them and provide them to me in the order so that we can cover your questions first. And then after that, we'll cover questions that were submitted or identified prior to the show. So first, a little introduction. I'm Aaron Hall. I'm here today as an educator, not as a licensed attorney. Even though my regular job is to serve as a licensed attorney and I represent business owners and their companies, today I'm here as an educator. What does that mean? It means a little disclaimer. I'm not representing you. So please keep in mind that when you pose questions, which I will do my best to answer, I'm answering them in an educational setting. We're using your question as a prompt to discuss a subject to educate the audience in general. That's very different from an attorney representing you. I'm obviously not representing you. And you obviously have no attorney-client privilege here because you're posting on a public video. This will sit out there on the internet. So please keep any confidential information off the platform. Don't include it in the question because whatever information you put in the question, will be sitting out here on the internet. One of the reasons that it's important to understand the difference between me presenting as an educator versus you getting advice from an attorney is an attorney can take the time to ask you questions to really understand your circumstances. These questions often identify exceptions or important considerations when crafting a legal response for you or legal advice for you. Another important reason is an attorney understands the laws in your jurisdiction. I'm speaking generally. I'm not necessarily even talking about the laws of Minnesota. I'm talking about the general laws as adopted by most states, perhaps. But if you are going to rely on advice, it needs to be from a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction, not an educator providing general educational information on the internet. So I highly recommend that you don't rely on anything you learn here, but rather use it to identify issues to discuss with your attorney and help use it to build your general education. The purpose of this YouTube channel is to educate you as a business owner so you can avoid common problems, discuss those issues with your attorney, and hopefully have a more successful company and successful life. All right, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. And by the way, if you are here today, you may have heard about this through our presence on a social media platform. And thank you. I'm not sure if you subscribed or we are connected, but it's great to connect with you there. Another option for you, if you want educational information that's not publicly available online, is to go to aaronhall.com/free. There you will get access to exclusive videos to educate business owners on how the law works in a way that's relevant to business owners. It's practical, it's educational, and it's designed to help equip founders, entrepreneurs, and CEOs to avoid problems and learn how to navigate the law as you're growing a company. Also, if you haven't already subscribed here on YouTube or on our YouTube channel, feel free to do that, and you'll get notified about upcoming videos just like this of an educational nature. All right, enough of an introduction. Let's get into the questions. All right, the first question here. This at be As we're waiting for live questions to come in, I'm going to answer a question that I was asked by a CEO this past weekend. This CEO has grown an organization that is highly successful. And now the organization is seeing substantial growth, and they are projecting double or triple the size of an organization that existed previously. So for many years, it was about the same size, and now it is on the upswing, and all indications are the company will double or triple. So here's the question. If you are a CEO of a company that's growing quickly, what should you keep in mind as you enter that new phase of company growth? Put another way, if you are the growing from a small company to a mid-sized company, what should you as a CEO pay attention to? Well, I'm going to share with you some mistakes I've made as I was growing a company, and I'm going to share with you some of the insights I learned from other people. First, I'll share with you from some simple items. From a technology standpoint, usually when you have less than 10 people, you don't have to have strict permissions. A lot of people can access everything except maybe an HR or confidential folder. But as you grow larger, the marketing people don't want the other departments dabbling in their materials, and the accounting people don't want everybody to have access to all the financials, and every department needs its own security permissions. And so as a result, you need a more robust security infrastructure and software infrastructure as you grow. So typically when you go from 10 employees to 25 or 30 employees, you need a whole different set of software to support your organization. And then again, when you hit 100 employees or more, again, you need that. Another reason for that is when you have 5 or 6 employees, you know what each one of them is doing. But when you have 100 employees, statistically, you're more likely to have a rogue employee or internal fraud or deception. And so you need to have reasonable precautions in place to protect yourself as a company. That's the IT standpoint. Next, from a management and relationship standpoint, you as a CEO are going to go from knowing everybody and being able to interact with them on a daily or at least weekly basis when you are 10 employees to say 25 or 30 employees, where you can't possibly spend a half hour or hour with each person each week. So you will find as you hit 25 or 30 employees that all of a sudden you have much less time with many of the employees. And then when you go to 80 or 100 employees, obviously, if you just do the math, you don't have enough time in the week to connect with each person. At some point, you'll find you have maybe a small amount of role in the hiring process, but you might even lose track of who some of the new hires are, especially if they're more entry-level employees. What does all that mean? It means you need a whole different system of management and supervising and accountability for each employee in the company. If you're navigating these changes, one book I highly recommend is Traction, Get a Grip on Your Business by Gino Wickman. It talks about the entrepreneurial operating system, or EOS, and it's written for companies of about 10 employees who are going to 20, 30, and 40 employees on up to 100. It's an outstanding book used by thousands, if not 10,000s of companies in the United States who are within 10 to 100 employees. So we've talked about IT, or information technology. We've talked about HR and management of people. But now let's talk a little bit more about the threats. A CEO often comes under more threats. Those might be threats of lawsuits. Those might be people who are trying to get something from the CEO or mislead the CEO. So the CEO has to be much more careful. We all have heard the scandals that involve CEOs, whether it's affairs or other messes that the CEO has gotten involved in. And so the accountability goes up for that CEO, and also the threats go up. CEOs have to be on guard, and the people closest to the CEO needs to guard them. Likewise, the CEO's time becomes even more important. So in the old days, when an owner of a 8 employee company can be involved in each department and each thing and really stay in touch with what's happening on the front lines, a CEO simply doesn't have time for that. The CEO has to delegate so that the CEO can elevate her attention to whatever is most important for the CEO to pay attention to. What is that? Usually, the most important thing for a CEO to pay attention to includes uh, the next 10 years and setting a strategic plan. The key outside relationships that support the organization. Holding accountable the key inside relationships. So those are going to be the officers and the department leaders. Deciding what the company is involved in and what the company is not involved in. In other words, identifying what you're going to say no to and what you're going to say yes to. And then, of course, the CEO is brought into many of the big problems that arise within the company. I'll never forget when I had a conversation with Jean Taylor. Jean Taylor is the daughter of Glenn Taylor, who owned the Minnesota Timberwolves. And Jean is an outstanding executive and leader and a coach to leaders. I asked her to come speak to a conference with CEOs and business owners. And she and I had a conversation about what is the most important mistake she sees CEOs and business owners make. And she said the quality that often is overlooked is awareness. Because a business owner or CEO is so focused on what's happening, they may not be aware of the issues or concerns that are coming down the line. Sometimes they are subtly presented. And it was very ironic that at the time Jean told me this, I was not being aware to a scandal that was arising within my own law firm. I remember after talking with Jean thinking about how do I become more aware? What does that look like? Because it's easy to say you need to be aware, but how do you become more aware? I'm not going to cover that in this video, but I think it is a great question for CEOs to consider. And what I'll tell you is what happened next in my firm. What I didn't realize is the person I had entrusted with the finances of the law firm had misappropriated tens of thousands of dollars of money we were holding for clients and used that money for an illegal and wrongful purpose without anyone knowing. Of course, I later found out about it, reported it to the appropriate government authorities. That person was suspended from the practice of law for a period of time. We repaid all of the money to the clients whose money was wrongfully taken. But it was a legal mess that went on for years. I could have avoided that, perhaps, if I had been more aware, if I had been more attentive to what was going on. If I had investigated certain things more that at the time I may not have realized needed further investigation, but in hindsight, I look back and I realize they did. So awareness by CEOs becomes of preeminent importance. The former CEO of Yahoo, um, Marissa Mayer, I believe her name is, talked about when she became CEO of Yahoo, one of the surprises to her was how much she lost privacy because all of a sudden somebody else was handling her email, her calendar, uh, all her communications with people. In fact, many of her personal errands and personal issues that she needed attending to needed some form of assistance so she could devote more of her time to the company. So often CEOs will find that the more people who report under them, the less time they have and the less privacy they have when dealing with all of their personal and family matters. One other common problem faced by you as a CEO as your organization substantially grows is you will be perceived as having the Midas touch. You will be perceived by outsiders as being so successful. And sometimes that can get to CEOs' heads because as it's growing, things are going well. The system is working. And you might be getting a lot of credit for it and start thinking, hey, I'm pretty smart. It's pretty amazing what I put together. Obviously, arrogance and pride is a great risk for any CEO. But there's another part of that that CEOs often miss, and that is that the people around them often don't provide honest feedback or constructive criticism of ideas because they perceive the CEO as so smart. Who am I to challenge the CEO? That results with the CEO being in more of an echo chamber. The CEO says, here's an idea I had, and everyone goes, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Here's an idea I had. Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. And you may have simply the problem of too many great ideas that you can't execute. You might also have the problem that the CEO is putting out some bad ideas, and the CEO loses the protection provided from reasonable people scrutinizing ideas and giving honest, constructive feedback on those ideas. So I think it's an important part of any CEO's job as they grow to remind everybody who works with them that uh, they are not all knowing. They are not uh, every idea of theirs is not great. And it is the people's job who work with the CEO to give critical analysis and feedback. There are some companies that build this right into the management system. Ray Dalio, great fund manager and author of a book on important principles of life and success in business, talks about how they have a process of voting on ideas and when the votes are cast, it's cast by various people in management and people who have a different perspective than management. Now, there may be some weighting to the votes. So you're not giving the same weight to a person who's been in the company a month as the CEO. And you are going to have an expectation that people will articulate their concerns with a particular idea, so the merits of those ideas can be scrutinized. But the idea is many great CEOs build a system into their decision-making process in leadership so that the CEO's ideas are scrutinized. So as a CEO or a business owner, and you go from 10 employees to 20 or 30, or from 30 employees to 100 or 150, you will be making substantial jumps that require an entirely different structure in all different categories of your company. Um, we've covered IT, HR, leadership, management. Your financial reporting will have to look entirely different. Your org structure will look entirely different. This is why so many companies can struggle in that growth process. So, to summarize, one of the best things a CEO can do when navigating the growth of a company is to clearly identify what should the CEO focus on and stay laser focused on that and delegate all the other aspects of that would vie for the CEO's attention. All right, let's move on to the next question. I have a business idea that I want to test. I'm concerned about whether I should start an LLC or remain as a sole proprietor prior to uh, building that business idea. How do you decide when to start an idea, or I'm sorry, how do you decide when to start an LLC or corporation for a new business venture that might fail right away versus waiting until there's some level of success before starting that LLC or corporation? I love this question because it gets to the heart of why should you have a business entity versus staying as a sole proprietor. What is a sole proprietor? A sole proprietor is anyone who does business. You don't need to register. You don't need to file anything with the government initially. A sole proprietor is simply a person who runs with a business idea. Now, a common misconception is that they cannot deduct their business expenses. That's entirely false. In the United States, a sole proprietor can look at all the profits or the revenue that comes in and compare that to the expenses of the company. And the difference is the profits. And you pay income tax on the profits, but which means you can deduct effectively the expenses of the business. That's all on Schedule C of your tax return. So a sole proprietor is basically running a company without limited liability protections. The benefit of a limited liability company is that limited liability shield, that protection that shields you as an owner from liabilities of the business that you shouldn't be personally liable for. Likewise, a corporation has a corporate veil, which is essentially the same thing as a limited liability shield. It is basically a legal line that prevents you from being liable for lawsuits or liabilities of the company. Let's talk about what those liabilities are. So let's say, for example, that you run a restaurant and you are a sole proprietor, and one of the servers in the restaurant accidentally spills coffee on a child, and that child is badly scarred, sues. It was due to negligence, and so there is a $1 million judgment against in favor of the child. Who's going to be liable there? If you have a sole proprietorship, you are liable, and that's because you do not have a limited liability shield. If you had an LLC or a corporation, you would not have any personal liability for the injury that resulted as a part of the business. But now let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's imagine that you are the one who accidentally spills coffee on the child. In that case, it doesn't matter if you have an LLC or a corporation because you were the one who committed the wrong. You were the one who was negligent. And as a result, you are going to be personally liable for your own actions. You're always liable for your own actions, even if you have an LLC or a corporation. There's one other scenario we should talk about for an LLC or a corporation, and that's a contract. If an LLC or corporation enters into a contract, the business is liable, you are not liable personally. Now, there's one big exception. If you sign a personal guarantee, that means you are saying, hey, if the business can't pay, I will personally pay. So obviously, you are personally liable if you sign a personal guarantee for a contract signed by your LLC or corporation. Now that we understand the purpose of an LLC or corporation, let's go back to when does it make sense to set up a business entity like LLC or corporation for an idea that's untested and may not actually take off? I think the answer to that is whenever you determine that the risks of getting sued or some sort of liability in the business are substantially greater than the expense of setting up an LLC or corporation. There's one other reason that people will set up an LLC or corporation, and that's optics. From a public relations standpoint, you may be perceived as more credible or legitimate if you have a corporation or LLC rather than operating as a sole proprietor. But I knew a solo attorney. So this is an attorney who had uh, worked on his own, no other attorneys there, who operated as a sole proprietor for decades. And his view was because he's doing all the legal work, he's going to be personally liable for any sort of errors that occur. And he had malpractice insurance for that, so he had the insurance coverage for it. But he saw no benefit to setting up an LLC because he was going to be personally liable anyway for all of the work that he did. Now you might say, well, what about contracts? If he had an LLC that signed contracts, then he wouldn't be personally liable for it. That's true, but he had so few contracts, he had no reason not to honor those contracts, and they were small enough that he easily could pay them. He really wasn't concerned about trying to limit liability for obligations of the business. So the guiding principle, I think, when determining whether to set up an LLC or corporation versus stay as a sole proprietor is is there a public relation or credibility benefit by being able to tell customers or vendors or others in the business market that you're in that you are a business entity like an LLC or corporation? And will your business have significant risks of liability or lawsuits that are greater than the expense of setting up an LLC and managing that? There's one other consideration, and that's for an S corporation. An S corporation can help you save money on payroll tax. We will put in the description section below on the YouTube video a link to where I talk about the tax benefits of an S corporation. And that's another important consideration because if you're making, say, more than $50,000 a year in profits in the company, you should seriously consider becoming an S corporation to reduce your tax liability. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to add those. I appreciate the question that was submitted here during the live session. Why is passive income a scam? Or put another way, why have I said passive income is a scam? I see so many YouTubers and creators and influencers talking about passive income, about how amazing it is and how you can get rich quick, or maybe get rich slowly, but how you can get rich with passive income and how extraordinary it is as a way to make money. And the problem, I see two problems with passive income that I think are really important for people to know in advance. Passive income is generally only available when you do a lot of work or make a lot of investment in advance that you don't get paid for. And so it means you're actually just getting a payment over time. So another way to look at passive income is income that comes in later rather than right away. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't necessarily do that, but keep in mind, sometimes you're better off getting paid for the work up front rather than creating something and hoping for a stream of income. So passive income, technically, in my opinion, it's not really passive. It may become passive at one time, but initially it's very active. In fact, you're working a ton without actually getting payment for that. It's the payment that comes over time, and it's that later period when there's actually passive income. The second reason I think passive income is misleading is because I have never actually seen where something continues to generate income without somehow being managed. I'll give you an example. The song Happy Birthday is copyrighted, and every year it generates a lot of money in license fees. But think about it. Somebody has to track all those licenses, has to invoice for those, has to send out copyright infringement notices to people who use the song in an improper manner. In other words, while there is a royalty or a license fee being paid for a song that's been created, it's not fully passive. It actually requires a lot of management to keep getting that money in. Now, for the artist who outsources the management to somebody, yeah, it may be passive to the artist because they're paying somebody to actually manage it. But is that truly passive income when you're actually having to pay somebody to manage it? People can quibble about that. Likewise, let's imagine you buy real estate. A lot of times real estate is considered passive income, but any real estate needs to be managed. Maybe you have an Airbnb. Well, you have to interface with every tenant who comes in for a short-term rental. Or let's say you own some commercial property. You're going to have to work on the leases for that property whenever they're up for renewal. And when there are problems with the property, you need to hire a maintenance company to deal with those problems. There's ongoing maintenance and expenses associated with maintaining any real estate. Yes, you can outsource that to a management company. Thus, perhaps you could argue it's passive to you. But what I want to point out to people who are considering passive income is that you can't just create something and then totally ignore it and it will just start generating money. It needs to be managed to ensure that you continue to get paid for that. So although passive income is a category in the tax code, that is generally for people who are delegating or outsourcing the management role. And so their particular role truly is passive. And there are some other examples of that. Perhaps one way that is passive is if you invest in the stock market. But as any person who invests in the stock market will tell you, you still probably need to take a look at that and manage that from time to time. There's still some work that's involved. If you put money in an index fund, a mutual fund, it may be able to sit there for a long time and generate some revenue. And that perhaps is the truest form of passive income. But even then, some work is involved. And so the reason I say passive income is a scam is because it involves either a lot of work or money up front, or management over time, or both. And so while one person's role may actually be passive at a specific point in time, substantial amount of work is actually involved. And business owners I think business owners are misled if they believe that they can ever just totally forget about an asset or a business, hoping that they'll just enjoy passive income from that. Why do I hate long contracts with legalese? The purpose of a contract is to put in writing the agreement of the parties. And so if you have a very long contract signed by two entrepreneurs who are going to go into business together, and let's imagine that contract has a lot of legalese. Usually, the business owners do not have a full grasp of all the terms, and they certainly don't understand a lot of the legalese that's in there. Many times business owners present to me documents that are 10 to 20 pages long, sometimes 40, 50, or 100 pages long. I had this recently where two people were looking at going into business together. They used a template that they paid for online from one of these template services like LegalZoom. And this document was horrendous. It was over 100 pages long. It actually was a multi-part document, contracts for this and contracts for this and bylaws. And these business owners had no idea what these particular documents meant. In fact, as I was looking at them, I realized it would take hours to read through this. And even then, I'd have to sit and have conversations with these business owners for hours, if not days, to figure out if the language in there actually reflected what the business owners intended. Unfortunately, business owners often find themselves signing very long documents that they don't fully understand, perhaps haven't fully read, but certainly the documents don't reflect the core concerns and interests of the business owner. So, in my view, a very long document or a contract with a lot of legalese is a great disservice to business owners. Here's my approach to drafting contracts. I will ask the business owners, what are you giving to the other party and what are you getting from the other party? In other words, what is the exchange? What's most important to you? We need to make sure that is documented here. Next, what are the potential problems that could arise in the future? And how does that look? Next, we talk about what does the exit plan look like? If the parties need to leave this contract, is that process documented in the contract so that they don't have to go to court to try to terminate the contract? And then I look at it as an attorney using my years of experience and say, what other concerns are not addressed in here that typically would be in a contract? And what other terms are usually in a contract of this type that are not addressed here? That's my approach to drafting a contract. So, although it may have a little bit more than what the business owners would actually talk through, it is going to be things that make perfect sense when a business owner reads it. And that's the beauty of a contract, when it reflects the actual concerns, goals, and terms that the business owners understand and sets an expectation for the future. So when problems arise, the business owners know where to go and what to look at in those contracts. All right, next question. What are the best ways to sell a business? A lot of times, business owners have spent their whole life building a business, but they haven't thought a lot about selling a business and what their options are for selling a business. So, their first response is usually to look at, could I sell it to one of my employees or could I pass it down to a family member like a daughter or son? If that's not an option, because, for example, maybe the employee doesn't have the money to buy out the business owner. It's usually a problem. Maybe the son or daughter doesn't have the skill set to run the business. That's often a problem. The business owner then looks to find outside sellers. And usually, what they do is they look for a business broker. A business broker, for example, might be Sunbelt or Calhoun Companies or one of these other business brokers. There are nationwide companies that sell businesses, and there are local uh, companies that sell businesses. Sometimes companies or brokers will focus on a particular niche, like dental practices. They will work with dentists who own practices to find another dentist to buy that practice. And the nature of the dental practice is unique enough that there's value in having a broker who understands that sort of business. Of course, the buyer has to be a dentist, so the brokers can help find buyers. So that's one option. But often business owners don't know what are the other options. Well, one of the best options is to find a strategic buyer. A strategic buyer is somebody who will benefit not just from the profits of the business if it continues to be run as it is, but also from some sort of synergy with that buyer's existing business model. For example, let's say you have a technology company that creates a really nice feature which it has patented as part of an e-commerce store. If Amazon were to buy that company, they wouldn't necessarily just be concerned about how much money can that company keep making using its existing business model. Amazon might want to use that technology for its entire e-commerce platform. There's an example of where the synergy, because of Amazon's business model, produces far more value to Amazon than just the profits of the company they acquired. So often when you are selling your business to a third party, you're going to be paid on a multiple of EBITDA. In other words, you are going to be paid a number of years, so say 3 years times, that's the multiple, 3 times EBITDA. And EBITDA is earnings before, what is it here? Interest, oh boy, I shouldn't have tried to do this on the fly. Interest, taxes, feel free to add in the comments here. What is EBITDA? I should have just looked that up. But EBITDA is essentially a way of formulating the profits of the company. And so sometimes when selling a company, you will look at 3 years of profits as the sale price. But if it's a riskier company that may not last a long time, maybe you would do 1 year of profits as the purchase price for the company. Or if it's a company that's going to be around for many, many years, like a utility company, you might say 15 years of profits is what a buyer would pay for that company. What I usually see is somewhere between 2 and 7 years of profits for most companies. For example, a manufacturing company might be 5 years or 7 years, especially if they have some intellectual property like patents. So if you sell to a strategic buyer, you are going to get much more than the usual calculation of profits times a certain number of years, because the strategic buyer can benefit much more from that acquisition. So a strategic buyer is one of the best options. Another creative option that isn't considered much is setting up an ESOP. An ESOP is an employee stock option plan. It allows you to sell some or all of your company to your employees. Most people don't understand how this works, and so I'll summarize it really quickly. The company, which we assume has some financial stability and some forecasts that are profitable, can take those financial reports to a bank and say, hey, bank, we would like to borrow against this so that the employees can buy some of the stock of the company. Let's say the employees buy 49% of the company, so that you as an owner might remain 51% owner. That's one way to do it. Another way is you give the employees a majority ownership, but perhaps you reserve a seat on the board or a controlling role on the board so that you are still able to control the company even though you give up most of the profits. So hypothetically, let's say you give up 60% of the shares of the company to the employees. This would go into typically a trust, and you would have a committee or trustees who manage that. And in exchange for the employees buying these shares from you, let's say you get $1 million. But the employees don't have that million. So where does that million come from? It comes from the bank. So the bank loans the money to the trust and the company, which guarantee repayment. And the shares are often collateral for that debt. And that allows the owner to take some money off the table, if you will. So that is one way owners can get money out of their business by selling a portion of it. Now, there are a lot of pitfalls with an ESOP. Also, it requires significant professional expenses. In my experience, you'll pay between $50,000 and $150,000 to set up an ESOP, and then you'll often pay close to $50,000 a year to maintain it. So it's not for every company, but for larger companies where the idea is to pass along ownership to the employees, that can be valuable. Another option is to sell the business to an employee in the company who might acquire the shares over time. And it might be seller financed, meaning you as an owner are helping loan the money to the employee to buy it back from you. The interesting aspect of this is that it can, by seller financing, you can get stronger employee buy-in, at least is how the theory goes, by having the employees be the owners. But there's some common problems with seller financing. First, who has ultimate control over the company? If the seller, the longtime owner, maintains control, the buyer, the employee, may feel like, you know what, it doesn't feel like I really own this business if I can't control it. And I'm putting a lot of, I'm committing years of my life to this, and it's frustrating that I don't control it. I don't have any say. So usually the buyers want to control the business. But then what happens if the buyers make changes that the longtime owner is not comfortable with? Normally, that owner feels like you're destroying my company, and I'm not going to get paid if you destroy my company by making these dumb decisions. Typical decisions that are controversial, from my experience, are the employee wanting to implement new software that the employee feels will make the whole system better, more efficient, produce better results, better information. The seller usually is not as tech savvy because they're older, and they say, um, it's working well as it is. Why create all the complexity and distraction of new software when we can just keep running it as it is? Um, Also, the new owner or the seller, the owner might say, this software will cause me to lose touch with what's actually happening in the company. And I like running things the way it is. I don't want to learn a bunch of new software to figure out how things go. So that's just a glimpse of some of the problems with seller financing from an owner, either to an employee in the company or to an outside buyer. So when looking at selling your company, there are a couple other options. You could look at selling to a venture capital firm who will buy the company from you. And then there's some hybrids of the scenarios we've talked about today. What's the takeaway here? Really, a takeaway is to figure out what is the best option for you when selling your company, and how can you get the most money from the company, while also keep in mind you want some assurances of actually getting paid, because a promise of a lot of money that you never actually get paid is worse than a more reliable payment that you can bank on or that you can put in your pocket. All right, let's take a look and see what other questions do we have here. Let's do one final question for today. Is a letter of intent binding and enforceable? Well, what is a letter of intent? A letter of intent is simply a letter. So it's just a document prepared by one party writing something out. And it is explaining their intentions or their intent regarding a deal that is being contemplated by the parties. So usually parties are in negotiations and one side says, hey, send me a letter of intent. What are you interested in doing? I want to see it in writing. And that letter of intent lays out, we would like to buy your company, for example, and here are the terms and here are the conditions and here's what we're looking for. So the question today is a letter of intent binding and enforceable? In other words, is it a contract? Usually the answer is no, it's not, because it's just a letter. But there's a risk that it could be construed as an offer. In other words, a court may look at it later and say, you may have said that was a letter of intent, but it's actually written to be an offer. And when the other side said, we accept your offer, you might be bound to it like a contract. So a best practice when writing a letter of intent is to state right in the letter that this is not binding or enforceable, that this is a document of discussions that the attorneys or parties are having, but that no agreement is final until the parties have signed a written contract. One other part I often see, or one other approach I often see to letters of intent, is a portion of the letter of intent is not binding and enforceable, and another portion is. For example, you might have a confidentiality provision that is fully enforceable. The parties agree to keep the terms of their discussions confidential and any data or documents exchanged as they consider a transaction highly confidential. That confidentiality provision can be an enforceable contract, while the remainder of the letter of intent may be part of the non-binding and not enforceable part of the letter. So a letter of intent can be not binding, fully binding, or have a combination. It really depends on how that letter of intent is crafted. All right, we have another live coming up in 2 days. I look forward to answering your questions there. If you had any questions that didn't get answered, or if you are watching a recording of this, feel free to put your questions in the comments section below. I'd be happy to answer them. If you like videos like this where you can learn about business law and avoid some of the common problems that business owners face as they're growing a company, feel free to subscribe on YouTube or any of the other social media platforms that you use. And if you would like exclusive online educational content for founders and business owners, you can get that at aaronhall.com/free. It includes a checklist of common problems faced by new businesses. It includes videos going in depth into some of those problems so that you are empowered to set up your company for success. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you at the next live session.